I don't get played on, Mr. Little? It's entirely disappointing. It's interesting to ask a preacher to come and talk about a preacher and say, oh, you've got 5 minutes. I'm going to do my best. In fact, I thought it silly this morning to come and share any thoughts that I have about this man and about his spirituality, but instead let his own voice speak for himself. From Nonviolence and Racial Justice in the periodical Christian Century, 1957, The Meaning of Love. In speaking of love at this point, we are not referring to some sentimental emotion. It would be nonsense to urge men to love their oppressors in an affectionate sense. Love in this connection means understanding goodwill. We speak of a love which is expressed in the Greek word agape. Agape means nothing sentimental or basically affectionate. It means understanding, redeeming goodwill for all men, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men. When we love on an agape level, we love men not because we like them, not because their attitudes and ways appeal to us, but because God loves them. Here we rise to the position of loving the person who does the evil deed while hating the evil deed he does. Finally, the method of nonviolence is based on the conviction that the universe is on the side of justice. It is this deep faith in the future that causes the nonviolent resistor to accept suffering without retaliation. He knows that his struggle for justice, he has a cosmic companionship. This belief that God is on the side of truth and justice comes down to us from our long tradition of our Christian faith. There is something at the very center of our faith which reminds us that though Good Friday may reign for a day, but ultimately it will give way to the triumphant beats of the Easter drums. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a place and Christ a cross. But one day that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by him. So in Montgomery, we can walk and never get weary because we know that there will be a great camp meeting in the promised land of freedom and justice. This, in brief, is the method of nonviolent resistance. It is a method that challenges all people struggling for justice and freedom. God grant that we wage the struggle with dignity and discipline. May all those who suffer oppression in this world reject the self-defeating method of retaliatory violence and choose the method that seeks to redeem. Through using this method wisely and courageously, we will emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright daybreak of freedom and justice. From a sermon preached in Montgomery, Alabama, November 6, 1956, many persons realize the urgency of seeking to eradicate the evil of segregation. There will be many black persons who devote their lives to the cause of freedom. There will be many white persons of goodwill and strong moral sensitivity who will dare to take a stand for justice, but honesty impels me to admit that such a stand will require willingness to suffer and sacrifice. So don't despair if you are condemned and persecuted for righteousness' sake. Whenever you take a stand for truth and justice, you are liable to scorn. Often you will be called an impractical idealist or a dangerous radical. Sometimes it might mean going to jail. If such is the case, you must honorably grace the jail with your presence. It might even mean physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing could be more Christian. I still believe that standing up for the truth of God is the greatest thing in the world. This is the end of life. The end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to do the will of God, come what may. I still believe that love is the most durable power in the world. Over the centuries, men have sought to discover the highest good. This has been the chief quest of the ethical philosophy. This was one of the big questions of the Greek philosophy. The Epicureans and the Stoics sought to answer it. Plato and Aristotle sought to answer it. What is the summum bonum of life? I think I have discovered the highest good. It is love. This principle stands at the center of the cosmos. As John says, God is love. He who loves is a participant in the being of God. He who hates does not know God. And finally, from Dr. King's speech, The Power of Nonviolence, given at the University of California at Berkeley in 1957, I'm quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence who do not believe in a personal God. But I think every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice. That there is something unfolding in the universe, whether one speaks of it as an unconscious process or whether one speaks of it as some unmoved mover or whether one speaks of it as a personal God. There is something in the universe that unfolds for justice. And so in Montgomery, we felt somehow that as we struggled, we had cosmic companionship. And this was one of the things that kept the people together. The belief that the universe is on the side of justice. God grant that as men and women all over the world struggle against the evil systems, that they will struggle with love in their hearts, with understanding goodwill. Agape says you must go on with the wise restraint and calm reasonableness, but you must go on. We have a great opportunity in America to build here a great nation, a nation where all men live together as brothers and respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. Modern psychology has a word that is probably more used than any other word. It is the word maladjusted. Now, we should all seek to live a well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities, but there are some things with which our social order that I am proud to be maladjusted, and I call upon you to be maladjusted. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to mob rule. I never intend to adjust myself to the tragic effects and the methods of physical violence and to tragic militarism. I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things. I call upon you to be maladjusted as Amos, in the midst of the injustices of his days, cried out with the words that echo across the generation, "Let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not exist half slave, half free. As maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery could cry out, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who dreamed a dream that the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, God grant that we will be so maladjusted that we will be able to go out and change our world and our civilization. And then we will be able to move from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man to the bright, glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. And if I may, a couple more small ones. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning in the 20th century. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. There is so much frustration in the world because we have relied on gods rather than God. We have worshiped the God of pleasure only to discover that thrills play out and sensations are short-lived. Like the early Christians, we must move into a sometimes hostile world armed with the revolutionary gospel of Jesus Christ. With this powerful gospel, we shall boldly challenge the status quo. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. And finally, simply from me, as all good preachers do, we steal from great preachers. Amen. Let us love humility, love unconditionally, love our enemy, and may love keep moving forward.